Good news, everyone. I figured out how to combine the Jaws of Death with the Stardust Spire to make a lightning damage scissor. Well, not quite. Actually, I transmuted the Jaws of Death into the Northern Cross here, using the Bloodless Prince's ashes that we obtained last time. I did mention that they were useful for transmutation after all. For some reason, this weapon has an incredibly lore-filled description. You can go back and pause that if you're interested. I'm not going to pay too much attention to it though. So what we're going to be doing today is backtracking stuff as well as some optional content that we now have the ability to access now that we have all of the brands. First of all, we're going back to check out a few items that we can pick up as soon as we have the Shadow Flip brand. I just figured this would be a better time to save it for. This one here is all the way back in the Village of Smiles. A pouch of salt doesn't seem too worth it, but that's because there was also a spell here. But because we already have a copy of it, we do not get an additional one. It's a wildfire, by the way. So that's a way that you can get a free copy, but honestly, it's so late in the game, you're better off just purchasing it from the mage for 5k gold. It's really not that great of an expense after all. This other item is located above the real Jester. We actually saw this room initially, and I think picked up a shield of some sort. It wasn't a very good one though. And by traveling further up, we can pick up the Lamprey set, which is yet another heavy armor set that we will never be wearing. Yeah, heavy armor is just too heavy to be worth it. And the defense boost over lighter armor sets really isn't all that great. So even if you want to play a tankier character, you're better off using light armor for the most part, and then using your extra weight availability for like a shield or a heavier weapon. So this also ends up leading back to the beginning of the game in another shortcut that doesn't really matter much at all. We'll certainly never be using it. Next, we're going to want to be traveling back to the Ziggurat of Dust, not to explore its insides, but to go up and around it. First, of course, we have to take down this White Knight, which goes down very quickly. So, one interesting thing about the Northern Cross is that it actually does 3 damage types. It does physical damage, which scales with strength, and then it also does lightning damage, which scales with magic. The scaling, by the way, is S for both, so if you have a heavy investment in both stats, this weapon is quite powerful indeed. So as I was saying, the Northern Cross actually does 3 damage types, and that is due to a special flag that is on the weapon called Extra Blunt. What Extra Blunt does is it converts the damage of all weapons in that weapon loadout half to blunt. This means that half of the Northern Cross's physical damage is slashing, and the other half is bludgeoning or blunt or whatever you want to call it. And that results in us doing significantly more to some enemy types like the White Knight, and significantly less to other enemy types such as these cave keepers here who are quite resistant to blunt. This passage, by the way, also leads to the Ruined Temple, which we're not going to be exploring this time. But this entrance is worth keeping in mind. It's one of a number of ways to enter this area. So as I was saying, the Extra Blunt tag converts the damage of all weapons that you have equipped in that loadout half to blunt. So that means, say, if you have a gun in that loadout, it will end up doing 75% blunt damage and 25% slashing, since it normally does 50-50 of each. So that's basically a way that you can shit out a ton of strike damage if you don't want to use a big, heavy warhammer. Quite useful for dexterity builds, especially since there are quite a few guns that scale heavily with dexterity. Alternatively, you could end up one-handing a weapon with the extra blades property, such as the Purifier Scythe that we used earlier, in order to make a gun deal more slashing damage, if that was something you wanted to do if you were fighting an enemy that was weak to slashing damage, but resistant to striking damage. Just some cool mechanical manipulation you can do if you're in the know. If you want to be in the know, by the way, I definitely recommend checking out the Fextra Life Wiki. Not something I would normally be saying. Normally the Fextra Life wikis are hot garbage, but in this case they have extra information that you can't really find elsewhere, thanks to the developers of the game giving the Fextra Life wiki admins a whole data dump. So the wiki has a whole bunch of additional information on weapons and other things. Anywho, having dealt with that last white knight there, we can finally cross the far beach and actually make our way back around to an area that we've been to before, the Dome of the Forgotten. So as soon as you beat this area and acquire the Blue Shift brand, you can actually head to the right out of the dome and end up at the Ziggurat of Dust much earlier, and that's how you get there early if you want to get the Dot brand as soon as possible. But that's all we're interested in here, so let's have the boatman, I'm the boatman, take us to the other side, the fort beyond the mire. If you recall, there was a path from there that we elected not to take at the time, that I mentioned led back into Hager's Cavern, or out of it if you come from the Hager's Cavern direction. Again, a way that you can skip the Mire of Stench entirely if you want to do so. There are a few useful items down that pathway, so we are definitely going to want to travel down it. Thankfully, the residents in this fort here aren't much of a threat. They really weren't before when we came here last time, and they're even less of a one with our great honking scissors. Although oddly, even though they're the same enemy type, the Rotten Raiders, as were on the far beach, they actually take 2 hits of the scissor chop, as opposed to the 1 that those ones took, which leads me to believe that they might actually be a slightly different enemy type, because there are quite a few enemy types in this game that look incredibly similar to one another, if not nearly identical, but are technically separate. Alternatively, they could just be statted differently. And yeah, aside from a little bit of funny collision detection with this knight here when we knocked him off of his horse, this fight goes pretty smoothly. Again, I've said this multiple times throughout this playthrough, but you really, really want to learn the parry timing. It is just the way to deal with a lot of enemy types. I really would not want to fight one of those guys with anything else, because melee attacks, magic, they'll just block that shit with their shield and shrug it off completely, and then stun you while you're in your cooldown animation. Anyway, here we come to the path. A little bit above is where we picked up the Stardust Spire last time, but we're seeking to descend further below. So down here, there are going to be a few more Cave Keeper enemies, which are actually a pretty novel enemy type, because they not only generate light, but they steal any other light that's in their area. I'm not sure if this makes them stronger, but it is certainly a pretty cool gimmick. Now, the Cave Keeper that fled over in this direction, you're going to want to be a little bit careful of. You don't want to tread too far to the left here because, well, the Cave Keepers here have a big brother called a Crypt Keeper who we are going to want to buff up to the gills for, because they are far and away one of the most dangerous non-boss enemy types in the game. They are just a huge honking pile of defense and health. They attack quickly and without pause, and their attacks do a lot of damage. Thankfully, this weapon is perfectly designed for this, as they are quite weak to bludgeoning damage. Now, whether you can actually safely take him on or not, you are certainly going to want to steal his treasure, at least if you have the ability to use Class 2 prayers, because Divine Will here is one of the best buffing spells in the game, period. What it does is it provides the same effect of an item that we've picked up a few of, oh yeah, trap here by the way, whoops, that we've picked up a few of but have never actually used, the Warhorn. What the Warhorn and Divine Will do is give you a temporary buff that vastly boosts your stamina regeneration speed. And I cannot understate just how massive this boost to your stamina regeneration speed is. You can go from no stamina to full, just like, pretended I snap my fingers there. That. I can't actually snap my fingers, by the way, it's my eternal shame. But yeah, no, this buff really cannot be understated. It is an incredibly good one and very worth investing in prayers solely for, in my opinion. Now, not to say it's utterly broken, because there is still a lag time after you have used some of your stamina before your stamina starts regenerating at its full speed. So there'll be like a half a second where it regenerates at a slow speed, and then it will immediately kick up to the super buffed regeneration speed. So you do still have to be a little bit careful with managing your stamina, but in general it makes that so much less of an issue. That's actually one of the things that the Iron One's Creed has going for it. One of their Creed unique items is a replenishing Mountain Warhorn. Otherwise you have to rely on the regular Warhorn item, which are in pretty short supply. You can purchase them from clerics in the Iron One's Creed, but otherwise you'd have to farm them from the Rotten Raider enemy type. Anyway, here we eventually come back to a part of Hager's Cavern that we recognize, or that you should recognize. This sloping set of stairs. And at the top, angsty bones, let's not fight them, shall we? Let's just warp out and go to our next destination. No, it's not actually the Red Hall of Cages cutting out like just a few seconds here. Let's go to Crayons Pass. So, in between the previous episode and this one, I ended up farming up a few materials so that we could max out our devotion in this creed. Thus picking up a few more of these items, one more golden wine, one more iris wine in anticipation of future magery, and then one more blood red wine for more healing. So, now that our devotion is maxed out, the merchants sell a few more things. Notably, the blacksmith now sells the Resplendent set, which is a set of steel armor coated in gold. It's rather expensive, but it is certainly one of the more lustrous heavy armor sets. We may or may not be picking that up sometime in the future. Otherwise, the reason we came back to Crayons Pass here is to proceed further into it. If you recall, the last time we came here, our progress forward was balked by a redshift barrier that we can now have the ability to cross. Which is actually a little bit annoying, as there are also blue shift barriers that we need to put our torch down for to make disappear, and then bring back up to do a little bit of platforming. You can ignore some of this if you have the dot brand, but still, it's kind of annoying. And immediately we come to the end of the area. Crayons Pass is not very large, it's pretty much solely here for the creed and the boss. Buffing up to the gills, as we always do for bosses, let's go fight. So, Ronin Cran here is pretty analogous to a certain Dark Souls boss. He's pretty much a one-to-one with Artorias the Abyss Walker. He's a big, busted down, melee-focused dude who does a lot of acrobatic shit and can even buff himself up with dark power. If you have a great enough poise damage output, you can actually stun him out of his buffing animation and prevent him from completing it, thus dealing a lot of free damage and preventing him from getting his buff, which makes him more aggressive, gives him a few more attack moves, and overall buffs his damage. But yeah, as you can see, Ronin Cran here isn't exactly all that difficult of a fight. Even if you come in with a less powerful weapon, he still tends to go down quickly. He's also one of the bosses more vulnerable to poison damage, but why bother with that tree-hugging shit when you can just deal death damage and take him down a lot quicker. So yeah, that's Ronin Cran, not exactly the most exciting boss fight. Definitely could do with having higher stats. But you pick up his ashes as you do with all bosses, as well as the Twisted Heart, which is an item that we will not be using, as it is the final type of upgrade material for the Beast line, which only a very few weapons in the game use. It's questionable why that even exists, why those aren't just wrapped back up into the regular upgrade path. Also, you get an additional path into the Ruined Temple, which is not actually useful if you want to progress here, as it just leads to a side area that is locked off from the rest of the Ruined Temple. It has a few extra items, so it's worth exploring, but it won't actually lead you to progression. So, before we continue on to the next area, we're going to want to level up a few times and pick up Class 2 prayers, so that way we can actually use Divine Will. and we'll be making very good use of that in the next area. So, where are we going next then, you might be asking? Well, it's an area that you can very easily miss because there are only 2 entrances to it in the entire game, and they're somewhat well hidden. You can only just barely glimpse that they're there if you're paying especially close attention to your surrounding environment. And one of the 2 entrances is this crater here. If you climb up the right side, you may notice just the barest glint of hard light off to the left. And if you have the dot brand as well, you can platform across several hard light platforms. You can also use the jump glitch to get through this, but that is pretty difficult since if you fall, you'll fall far enough that you will die. And then you can do what is probably the coolest entrance to an area in the entire game, using a perfectly timed for you by the way, you don't have to do anything yourself, gravity shift to rocket far up into the sky, followed by a wall jump as well, so you're going to need that brand. And that takes you to Mael's floating castle, an area which is really cool and also really disappointing. The design of this area is pretty neat and incorporates pretty much all of the platforming based brands, and the entrance to the area is really awesome as well, at least that entrance is. The other one is from the Castle of Storms and is considerably less exciting. But the area itself is just ultimately disappointing because it is way too short. It's like a few rooms and then a boss and then that's it. If it were a larger, more fully developed area, I'd really like it, but as it is, it's just kind of a one-off, and for that reason it disappoints me. Oh yeah, unless you want to die, don't ever jump off of this castle. You will not survive the fall. So the other entrance to here that I mentioned that comes from the Castle of Storms ends up leading over to this side of this floating island. If you want to access it, it's from the right side of the shrine that is right before the Kraken Worm, and it only requires the dot brand as well as the hard light brand of course. Theoretically you could skip the dot brand with the jump glitch, but again that requires you to make so many of those jumps that I really wouldn't recommend that unless you really want to do this area as early as possible. And granted you might, because this area has the most conveniently available Crypt Keeper for farming, it being the closest to any shrine or sanctuary. The reason that you would want to farm them is because they are the only enemy type in the game that drops shimmering pearls. So if you didn't beat the Unspeakable Deep way back when, this is your only way of acquiring one aside from picking up one guaranteed one that comes after an optional boss fight later on. And that's also why I placed a stone guide at the sanctuary here to increase drop rates in general in the hopes of getting one. Sadly, that was not the case. So the main gimmick of this area is that pretty much every chest in here is a mimic. The item that we picked up from that one is a rather unique charm. It makes it so that every attack you deal consumes some of your salt, but it increases the damage that you deal with that attack. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of it. I feel that salt is better used for weapon and character upgrades, but if you want to increase your DPS if you're having trouble with a boss, and that might help you, it's something worth looking into. So yeah, as I mentioned before, one of the really cool things about this area's design is that it involves a lot of platforming and incorporates pretty much all of the platforming relevant brands. The Vertigo brand, the Blue Shift brand, the Shadow Flip brand, and the Dot brand. And that makes it a fairly unique level in that regard. Others utilize all of those, but not nearly so densely, not all at once. Oh yeah, these enemies here, by the way, you do not want to get caught under them because the attack that results is pretty damaging. Thankfully, we were at full health, so we were able to survive. But yeah, otherwise they're a fairly annoying enemy type, but not that threatening so long as you can avoid that one attack. They do have a pretty cool design though. I'm not entirely sure what they're supposed to be, but it makes me think of a torture device like an Iron Maiden, but come to life, much like what the Tree of Men was, albeit on a much smaller scale. Even if you're not a huge fan of the overall art style, you can't deny that there were some pretty cool enemy designs in this game. Here we come to what I consider a little bit of a dick move. It's a ladder that you can kick down to act as a shortcut, but it's really not immediately obvious that the ladder is up, at least to me. And if you try to platform over to it and grab onto it, you're just gonna drop and have to go through that entire section of the level again to get up here. And it is right before the boss. A rather nasty dropping platform which may cause you to jump a bit further than we did, which will end up aggroing the boss immediately, preventing you from doing prep work. But if you grab onto the ledge and then move forward not one more step, you do have just enough room to apply all of your buffs. And that's what we're doing right here, because the upcoming boss can be rather nasty. She's a bit of a glass cannon of sorts. So Mael here is interesting in that she can be taken on with pretty much any build because she has solid zeros across the board in terms of defense. The one exception being strike damage, which she is slightly resistant to. Probably an attempt at balancing how overpowered strike weapons are. Regardless of what build you come in here with, you're likely to be killing her very quickly. However, as I mentioned, she is a glass cannon, not just a glass. And she can very quickly kill you as well if you end up getting caught up in her magic, that one where it rains down a ton of pellets on the glowing spots on the floor in particular is her most dangerous move. If you get caught up in that, you will get stun locked to death and there's really not much you can do about it. But as long as you're fairly evasive, Mael goes down pretty quickly and pretty easily. And she doesn't exactly give much in the way of reward, no salt and a mere pittance of gold. However, you do acquire her ashes, which you can use in transmutation as always, and you get an additional few items. Hey, this here is one of the few chests that actually is not a mimic. And then immediately to the left is the final mimic of the area. Both give pretty good rewards, a new heavy armor set and our largest repository of salt yet, an entire box. But that's it for the floating castle. Next time we'll be exploring the ruined temple at last. Stay salty.